Number 1.
One of the more popular legends of colonial America was that of Prince Madog of Wales. Madog sailed west from Wales in 1170, perhaps becoming one of the first Europeans to reach the Americas. The story goes that the death of Madog's father, Prince Owain of Wales, triggered internecine strife among his successors. Desiring no part in the conflict, Madog sailed west across the ocean with a small fleet of ships. Some time later he returned to Wales, telling of an unknown country, pleasant and fertile. Convincing some of his countrymen to accompany him, he set sail again and never returned. The story does not end here, however. With the colonization of the Americas, the legend of Madog was renewed. It became common belief among the early settlers that Madog's explorers had intermarried with local Indian tribes. Their descendants were said to still reside somewhere in the country. Stories emerged among the colonists detailing encounters with the Welsh-speaking descendants of Madog. According to historian Reuben T. Durrett, the Madog tale was especially popular among the early settlers of Kentucky and was often told on long winter nights. The Falls of the Ohio area became especially connected with the Madog mythology. A story related to early settlers by local Indians meshed with the Madog legend. A tribe of white Indians remarkable for their light hair and blue eyes was said to have resided in the Falls area at one time. However, hostilities broke out between the white Indians and another neighboring Indian group. A final battle between the two tribes occurred on Sand Island at the Falls of the Ohio, where the white Indians were massacred. Contemporaries to this account soon connected the story of this white Indian tribe with the Madog legend, believing they had found the descendants of the Welsh voyagers. Further discoveries seemed to confirm this conclusion. A large burial ground was found on the north side of the Ohio, opposite the falls, with the haphazard arrangement of the skeletons, indicating they may have been the remains of the white Indians who were massacred. Earthen fortifications discovered at Devil's Backbone were also believed to be the work of the Welsh Indians. Most intriguingly, an account circulated of 6 skeletons found near Jeffersonville, Indiana in 1799. Each skeleton was said to have been encased in a brass breastplate emblazoned with the Welsh coat of arms. The present-day location of this armor is unknown, if indeed it ever existed at all. I find that the Madog story raises a number of intriguing questions. Why did the early settlers believe the Madog legend? Why was it so popular? Perhaps the story struck a chord with a group of people who were inhabiting a new country of people who might have delighted in finding something familiar in a strange place. Perhaps the story also served as an explanation for evidence of advanced civilization among the Indian societies of the Americas, evidence that did not mesh with the prevailing view of the Indian as barbaric and uncivilized. Perhaps most importantly, the Madog legend was simply a good story. Stories were undoubtedly one of the main forms of entertainment at the time. The Madog legend is a compelling story with an element of mystery. Like the tale of the lost colony of Roanoke, the ending is unknown. One cannot help but imagine what might have happened to Madog and those who sailed with him.
Number 2.
At the end of the 13th century, 2 Genoese brothers with a musical surname embarked on the adventure, fearsome at the time, of finding an alternative spice route. His idea was to arrive in India with 2 galleys, and for that, they had the help of Mallorcan sailors, but after crossing the Strait of Gibraltar, they did not know about them again. It is possible that they were shipwrecked trying to skirt Africa, but there are also those who suggested their route was to the west, which would have meant opening the door that Christopher Columbus followed. Those pioneers were called Ugolino and Vandino, or Guido, Vivaldi. It is frequent that the arrival of Columbus to America in 1492 usually tries to cloud with possible trips of previous navigators. It is proven that, in fact, some arrived before, as evidenced by archaeological excavations in the Viking site of Lanso Meadows, Newfoundland, Canada, and references to Vinland. We will not go over the usual argument that it was a very modest settlement, just over half a hundred inhabitants, ephemeral and forgotten. Other predecessors do not go beyond the mere hypothetical phase. In the case of the so-called pre-naut, the sailor who would have informed Columbus of a visit to a new world. He is often identified too cheerfully with a certain Alonso Sanchez de Huelva, although the name does not appear in documents of the time and, in fact, it was the Inca Garcilaso, the first to review it in 1609, in his royal comments, from stories he had heard circulated from mouth to mouth as a child. Finally, there are the sensationalist theories that give truthfulness to mere legends such as Saint Brandon's or the Last Templars. They could not miss, of course, or even go back in time to antiquity to propose alleged trips by Egyptians, Phoenicians, Romans and, in general, any other civilization whose presence on the other side of the Atlantic is sufficiently bizarre. counterfeit pieces with hieroglyphic alphabets tend to emerge cyclically. In that sense, not long ago Erdogan updated the Ottoman claim about it with full conviction and the inevitable map of Piri Reis as a flag, despite being proven to have been made in 1513. And there are also those that point to the Chinese fleet of Zheng He, who existed and made 7 trips but always sailing towards the southwest, to the Indian coast of Africa and its surroundings, that is, in the opposite direction to America. On the other hand, the expeditions that really tried to cross the ocean are usually left in the drawer. Some time ago we talked about an unusual one, which was organized by Abubakar II, king of Mali, anxious to know what was on the other side, and that disappeared on the high seas in 1312. But there were more, like those of the British sailors who sailed from Bristol or the Portuguese from the Azores, in both cases in search of those rich islands that the legends placed in the middle of nowhere, Hy Brasil, Antillia. This drive to unravel the secrets of the Atlantic also included, and despite having worse access, Italian navigators, fundamentally of Genoa, one of the maritime powers of the time, being of that origin the 2 brothers of whom we spoke at the beginning. The trip they starred was really prophetic, even though we barely know the details, as we ignore the data about their lives. We only know that they were engaged in the spice trade, whose negative conjuncture was what spurred them to act. That bad business started in 1291, when the Mamluk Sultan Barid al-Ashraf Khalil snatched San Juan de Acre from the Christians, forcing them to evacuate Tyre, Sidon and Beirut, and expelling them definitively from the Holy Land. This was a problem for the caravan routes that came from Asia and, consequently, a drastic reduction of the spice consignments, whose demand skyrocketed in parallel to its price. We had to look for alternatives, and the only one that seemed to avoid passing through Islamic territory was to open a seaway ad parts Indii per mare Oceanum. Several merchants joined to finance 2 galleys with Tadisio Doria at the helm. The Doria would finance the Portuguese and Spanish explorations 2 centuries later, and, in fact, in Seville a banker of that family, Francesco, worked, who contributed capital for Columbus's voyage. The ships of the Vivaldi were called Allegranza and Sant Antonio, and they carried a total of 300 sailors, plus a couple of Franciscan friars, their pilots being Mallorcan. They climbed on the first scale of the trip, which was in the Balearic Islands. We said before that it is unknown what the plan was and what was his itinerary, since the main historiographical source for this episode are the Annali that Jacobo Doria, uncle of Tadisio, presented to the authorities of Genoa in 1294. It says, Tadisio Doria, Ugolino Vivaldi and a brother of the latter, together with some citizens of Genoa, started an expedition that nobody until then had ever tried. They equipped 2 galleys in a splendid way. After supplying them with supplies, water and other necessities, they sent them on their route, in the month of May, to the Strait of Ceuta, so that the galleys could sail through the ocean to India and return with useful merchandise. The 2 brothers mentioned above were on the boats in person, and also 2 Franciscan friars, all of which truly amazed those who witnessed it, as well as those who heard about them. After the travelers passed through a place called Gazora, there was no more news of them. May God watch over them and bring them back healthy. There are other references that are those that bring the name of that brother, Vandino, of which Tadisio says that he did not accompany Ugolino on board, and that they indicate that they were carrying food for the very long term. No less than 10 years. The Book of Conocimiento, a geographical literary manual written by a Castilian friar in the second half of the 14th century that describes the world from the point of view of a traveler, following the model of Marco Polo, mentions the Vivaldi, saying that they were shipwrecked in the region of Guinea and that the son of Ugolino was found looking for his father. Sure enough, that scion was called Sarlian and had organized a rescue expedition in 1315 by not knowing anything about the 2 galleys. And he was not the only one, because 3 years before he had already left, led by Lancelotto Malicello, who decided to look first at the Canary Islands because an island of the Chinijo archipelago was called, and is still called, Allegranza, like one of the galleys. Only that on the way he found an island to which he put his name Lanzarote and liked it so much that he changed plans on the march, staying to live there for 2 decades until the Aborigines rebelled against the Europeans and had to leave. The region of Guinea was not what we would today understand as such, but the way to call all black Africa. The Book of Conocimiento situates the episode in Magdasar, which could perhaps be Mogadishu, Somalia, taking into account not only the cacophonous resemblance, but also that it describes it close to the kingdom of Prester John, traditionally located in the Horn of Africa. This would mean that the Vivaldi managed to double the Cape of Good Hope and sail north through the Indian Ocean. Now, the Prest Juan was just a willful legend, and also that book has a markedly fantastic tone. Not to mention that other details written by the friar seem to indicate rather that he is talking about the Atlantic African coast, since the Senegal River, the Mali Empire, are cited, as well as other places, in the case of Senegambia. Precisely, the Gambia River was the scene of a meeting between the Genoese sailor Antonio Eudoxus, who worked for the Portuguese, and a compatriot who claimed to be a survivor of the Vivaldi crew. Although the story of Eudoxus reproduces almost point by point the book of the Conocimiento, in the year of 1285, 2 galleys sailed from the city of Genoa, commanded by the brothers Ugolino and Guido Vivaldi Ugolino met Guidom de Vivaldi's Fratres, with the purpose of going, on the east per Levantum to parts of India. These galleys sailed a lot, but when they entered the Sea of Guinea Mary de Guinoia, one of the galleys broke his helmet and could not continue sailing further. The other, however, continued through this sea until he came to a city in Ethiopia called Menem. They were captured and detained by the inhabitants of this city, who are Christians of Ethiopia, subjects of priest John. The city is located by the sea, near the Gion River. They were so closely detained that none of them managed to return home. We see that the year is wrong. All these assumptions and unknowns did not do but enlarge more and more the legend on that trip, which leads to wonder what defeat could follow the ships and what would be its end. We have already said that the galley was not the type of ship suitable for navigating the ocean, for having too much length, a thin hull and triangular sails. The oars would not help too much with the huge Atlantic swell. Thus, things probably never went too far from the coast, and this one could betray them. Since the compass had not yet been invented and they lacked nautical charts of the area to be covered, after passing the columns of Hercules and making a possible stopover in the Canaries, perhaps they continued sailing parallel to the African coast, making sporadic landings. In this way they were able to reach the mouth of the Senegal River, where at least one of the galleys was wrecked, without knowing in what circumstances. In that area there are great shallows, in one of them the famous frigate Medusa ran aground, or what happened with the other. If we let imagination go, there are other alternatives. They were able to circumnavigate Africa, which means that the Portuguese Bartolomé Diaz was advanced almost 200 years ago, and, if they managed to reach India, Vasco da Gama to get lost in the Indian Ocean, either on the way back or do it in the Atlantic prow to America, prefiguring what Columbus would do successfully at the end of the 15th century.
Number 3.
Mansa, meaning king, emperor or sultan, Abu Bakr II was a 14th century ruler of the Mali Empire in West Africa. This period of time, i.e. the 14th century, was a time when the Mali Empire had reached its pinnacle. The wealth of the Mali Empire can be seen in the famous pilgrimage of Mansa Musa, Abu Bakr II's immediate successor, to Mecca. According to Arab historians, this ruler spent so much gold during his pilgrimage that the rate of the gold dinar fell by 6 silver dirhams. The empire's peace and stability may have allowed a rather bizarre episode in Abu Bakr's reign to take place. According to Syrian historian al-Yamari, who met Musa in Cairo, the Malian ruler's predecessor had abdicated his throne so that he could explore the Atlantic Ocean. The story of Abu Bakr from his successor. Very little is known about the life of Abu Bakr, and the only known written account about him at present may be found in the work of al-Yamari. It may be interesting to note that this account of Abu Bakr comes from the mouth of his successor, Musa, and seems to be an explanation of how the latter came to power. One English translation of al-Yamari's conversation with Musa is as follows: So Abu Bakr equipped 200 ships filled with men, and the same number equipped with gold, water, and provisions, enough to last them for years. They departed, and a long time passed before anyone came back. Then one ship returned, and we asked the captain what news they brought. He said, "Yes, O Sultan, we traveled for a long time until there appeared in the open sea a river with a powerful current. The other ships went on ahead, but when they reached that place, they did not return, and no more was seen of them. As for me, I went about at once and did not enter the river." The Sultan got ready 2,000 ships, 1,000 for himself and the men whom he took with him, and 1,000 for water and provisions. He left me to deputies for him and embarked on the Atlantic Ocean with his men. That was the last we saw of him and all those who were with him. And so, I became king in my own right. Whilst the aim of this story was to explain the way in which Musa gained the throne of the Mali Empire, heralding the beginning of a new lineage of rulers, there seems to be much more focus in modern times on the actions of Abu Bakr. If the words of Musa and al-Yamari are to be taken as reliable, this tale is not found in any other African or Arabic source, with the exception, perhaps, of oral tradition. Then the Mansa's abdication and subsequent voyage into the Atlantic Ocean may be considered as events that actually took place. A voyage to the New World? Yet, there are those who are not content to stop where al-Yamari's narrative ends and have extrapolated the tale. Instead of merely sailing on the Atlantic Ocean, Abu Bakr is speculated to have sailed across this body of water and even reached the Americas. Evidence that seemed to support such claims have even been presented. Place names on old maps, for example, are said to show that Abu Bakr and his men had landed in the New World. The Malians are claimed to have named certain places after themselves, such as Mandinga Port, Mandinga Bay and Sierra de Mali. The exact locations of such sites, however, are unclear, as one source states that these places are in Haiti, whilst another puts them in the region of Mexico. Another common argument is that metal goods from West Africa were discovered by Columbus when he arrived in the Americas. One source claims that Columbus himself reported that he had obtained metal goods of West African origin from the Native Americans. Another source asserts that chemical analyses of gold tips found by Columbus on spears in the Americas showed that the gold probably came from West Africa. Many other examples of the purported Malian presence in the New World have also been given, including skeletons, inscriptions, a building that looked like a mosque, linguistic analyses, and carvings said to depict Malians. Such evidence, however, is not entirely convincing, as the sources that list them do not provide additional information or references to further support their claims. For example, rather than merely stating that places named by the Malians were found on old maps, it may be more persuasive if credible examples to these old maps were given. Given that the present evidence for Abu Bakr's voyage to the Americas is unconvincing at best and non-existent at worst, it seems unlikely that the Malian ruler had reached the New World during his expedition into the Atlantic Ocean. Nevertheless, the tale of Abu Bakr's abdication and exploration of the Atlantic Ocean, once again, if Musa and al-Umar are to be believed, is a fantastic one, tantamount, perhaps, to a modern world leader quitting his/her job to become an astronaut.
Number 4.
While Christopher Columbus's monumentally bad sense of direction in 1492, which led to his discovery of the Americas, has been celebrated down the centuries as the pinnacle of the age of discovery, the equally confused meanderings of his countryman, John Cabot, have perhaps received less attention than they deserve. Cabot was not the first man to set foot in North America. Millions of Native Americans had seen to that. Nor was he the first European on the continent. The Viking settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Canada lays to rest once and for all the argument as to who got there first. Worse, he was not even the first Englishman to stride out confidently into God's own country. Yet when Cabot's ship, the Matthew, landed in what today is eastern Canada in June 1497, he began Britain's long and eventful association with the New World that continues to this day. With a neat and typical sense of symmetry, Columbus claimed the sultry southern half of the New World for Spain, while Cabot secured the windswept and frozen north for Henry VLL. Thus began a fierce rivalry between Imperial Spain and Tudor and Stuart Britain over spheres of influence in the area that in time threw up characters as colorful as Sir Walter Raleigh, Captain Henry Morgan and Blackbeard, Edward Teach. It was a rivalry, however, that may have claimed Cabot himself as its first victim. Born Giovanni Caboto in Italy in 1450, after plying his trade as a sailor across the Mediterranean, Cabot moved to England in 1484 to try his luck there. When Christopher Columbus, a fellow Genoese sailor, discovered America in 1492, he sparked off a rush of westward voyages by sailors, explorers and adventurers looking for the elusive western route to the Indies. Already mindful that the Spanish had a head start on him in opening up the New World, Henry VLL in England took up Cabot's proposal that he set sail to find a westward route to Japan. With the merchants of Bristol, Henry raised the funds to set Cabot on his way, and the Matthew was built, crewed and supplied to set sail in June 1497. When Cabot landed not in Japan but on the North American mainland, he remained unfazed and simply claimed the newfound lands for the crown. For establishing this foothold in Britain's new overseas empire, Cabot was showered with riches to the tune of £10 and encouraged to undertake a second expedition as soon as possible. But unlike later pioneers of Britain's overseas expansion, his £10 reward notwithstanding, Cabot was not to profit from his labors. On his second voyage in 1498 he mysteriously disappeared, never to return. It was not long before the rumors began that the Spanish had murdered Cabot in order to steal his valuable maps and charts of the northeastern American coastline. While, and perhaps because, this has never been proved, it is a rumor that persists today. Certainly, many more deaths followed as the Spanish and the British struggled to carve out their own areas of interest on the mainland and in the islands of the Americas, or as the region became an area for Britain and Spain to carry on the European conflicts by proxy, such as during the War of the Spanish Succession, where the American battlefields were almost as important as those in Europe. Ultimately, of course, Britain came to dominate the continent, at least until George III managed to mislay it during a small dispute over tea and taxes 300 years later. By that time, Britain's imprint on the Americas, initiated by an Italian serving under a Welsh monarch and ended by a German king of England, had left an indelible mark, shaping many of America's customs and institutions and prefiguring the polyglot society that America is today.
Number 5.
In 1845, the British explorer Sir John Franklin set off with a small team to navigate the last unmapped part of the Northwest Passage. Traveling on the HMS Erebus and the aptly named HMS Terror, they departed England in May. Their fates weren't known until 2014. The loss resulted in a flurry of activity in Britain from both the public and the government. Between 1847 and 1859, some 30 expeditions searched for the lost ships, most sponsored by the Admiralty and Lady Franklin. Search missions continued into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, although any hope of rescue had long been abandoned. Gradually, these missions found evidence that pieced much of the voyage together, but still left the biggest questions unanswered. John Ray's discovery of cannibalism on King William Island horrified Victorian Britain, with Charles Dickens and others rejecting the possibility of such barbaric behavior by Franklin's men. One of the unintended benefits of these missions was increased understanding and mapping of the Arctic and the completion of Franklin's quest for the Northwest Passage. In recent decades, archaeologists have continued to investigate the Franklin expedition with the help of Inuit oral history and expertise. In the 1980s, a team led by forensic anthropologist Owen Beattie examined the bodies of 3 crewmen found on Beechey Island and found high levels of lead and suggested that solder used to seal the food cans had been the source of contamination. This led to the theory that the physiological and neurological effects of lead poisoning had contributed to the eventual fate of the Franklin expedition. However, a 2013 study led by chemists at Western University has cast doubt on the role of food tins as the source of lead poisoning. In 1992, the Canadian government designated the Erebus and Terror a National Historic Site, despite not knowing their location. Since 2008, Parks Canada has led a large and much publicized search for the lost ships. Speaking from on board a vessel involved in this underwater search in Cambridge Bay in 2012, Prime Minister Stephen Harper voiced the federal government's support. It is truly exciting to be launching this new initiative to continue searching for the lost vessels of the Franklin expedition. On 9 September 2014, Harper announced that one of Franklin's ships had been found. It was identified later that month as the HMS Erebus. On 12 September 2016, a team from the Arctic Research Foundation, founded by Jim Balsillie, announced that they had found the Terror in Nunavut's Terror Bay, north of where the Erebus was found in 2014. The discovery was confirmed by Parks Canada on 26 September 2016. In October 2017, the British government announced that it would transfer ownership of both ships to Parks Canada while keeping a sample of artifacts. According to Canadian Environment Minister Catherine McKenna, the ships would be co-owned with local Inuit, who played a crucial role in locating the wrecks.
Number 6.
The ancient world was more connected than we often realize. Even before the rise of the Roman Empire, the ancient Greeks were trading with India. While sailors from either country couldn't make it the whole way, they often met in trade ports along the coast of Yemen, where the Greeks would trade for aromatics and other luxuries to bring back home. Eudoxus of Cyzicus, an ancient Greek explorer and sea navigator that is remembered by historical writings as one of the first sailors who managed to make successful trips between Arabian and Indian ports, explore Arabian Sea under contract from Ptolemy VIII king, the Hellenistic Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, and for his 2nd century BC attempt to circumnavigate the continent of Africa. Very little is known about the life of Eudoxus of Cyzicus, except from the records in several ancient documents written by Greek historian Posidonius and several other sources. According to such records, which are viewed as credible by modern historians and scholars, Eudoxus first traveled the monsoon wind system of the Indian Ocean after he heard of this new way of sailing by the shipwrecked Indian sailor that was brought to the court of the Ptolemy VIII in Alexandria. Using his help, Eudoxus of Cyzicus made his first journey to India in 118 BC and another in 116 BC, which he managed without the help of Indian guides. On his first journey, he managed to bring back cargo of precious stones and aromatics, while the cargo of his second journey remains unknown. However, his return home from second journey from India proved to be very eventful. After strong wind pushed him all the way to the coast of eastern Africa, he managed to find there a wreck of a ship of a peculiar design. He tried to find out which nation have managed to build such a ship and came to conclusion that this was a vessel made by the territory of Gades, which is located in today's Cadiz in Spain. This discovery led him to believe that circumnavigation of Africa is possible. He organized new expedition on his own, but the large distance and bad weather forced him to return back to Europe. After reorganizing, he tried to achieve his goal again, but he was never heard from again. Most historians agree that he most likely died on his journey.
Number 7.
Gaspar Corte-Real was a Portuguese explorer who participated in early Portuguese expeditions to find a northwest passage to Asia. It is believed that he was one of the first to reach Newfoundland and other parts of the northeast coast of Canada. He, along with his brothers, Miguel Corte-Real and Vasco Aines Corte-Real, and other explorers such as Bartolomeu Dias and Vasco da Gama, helped make the coastal nation of Portugal into a global empire by expanding their trade routes and discoveries. The life of an explorer was familiar to Gaspar since his father, João Vaz Corte-Real, was an explorer. Due to his father's prominence in Portugal, Gaspar and his brothers received one of the better educations that were available and had early experiences that helped forge their future as navigators. While acquiring his education, Gaspar lived in Lisbon, Portugal, where he served the Duke of Beja. This would be a fortunate relationship as the Duke of Beja would become the King Manuel I of Portugal in 1491. He would go on to serve in King Manuel's court. Portugal had begun amassing a trade empire. By the end of the 15th century, Bartolomeu Dias and Vasco da Gama had established a trade route around Africa to India. However, the discoveries of Christopher Columbus and John Cabot made a significant impact on Europe. King Manuel began to hire explorers to search for a northwest passage to Asia. This created an opportunity for the Corte-Real brothers. On May 12, 1500, Gaspar Corte-Real received a charter from King Manuel to discover and claim jurisdiction in the New World. He reached Greenland, believing it to be East Asia, but chose not to land. He set out on a second voyage to Greenland in 1501 with his brother Miguel Corte-Real and 3 caravels. Encountering frozen sea, they changed course to the south and reached land, believed to be Labrador and Newfoundland. There, they captured 57 native men, who would later be sold as slaves. Gaspar Corte-Real then sent his brother and 2 ships back to Portugal before continuing southwards. Gaspar was never heard from again after his 1501 expedition. His brother Miguel was granted permission to try and find his brother, however, he also did not return. The youngest brother Vasco was initially refused permission to search for his lost brothers by King Manuel, but was eventually given the lands of Newfoundland, where he launched a 3rd expedition to find his brothers. He was unsuccessful and his brothers were never heard from again. In 1918, a submerged stone was discovered by Professor Edmund Delabar of Brown University. The stone was inscribed with a Portuguese coat of arms and name Miguel Corte-Real. It appears as though Miguel Corte-Real lived in North America for 9 years after his disappearance.